Good evening, everybody. The belief that doing something wrong and breaking the law, committing sin, and doing that all for the greater good it's a pretty destructive belief. I would even go as far as saying it's a plague on Christianity. And I basically just described situation ethics, and I know that this has come up in our Sunday morning Bible class, and you might remember talking a little bit about that with Rahab and her lie that she told in Joshua chapter 2. And so we talked about it a little bit there, but so I'm not going to rehash all that this evening. Some of this will be new stuff. But this particular belief, it kind of completely throws any kind of laws and commandments, just throws them to the side, really, religious or not. It doesn't have to be so much a religious thing. But in religion, it matters far more. It matters far more when God is in the picture here. Because according to situation ethics, even though a law or a commandment from God exists, and it's there, has been given to us for the express purpose of guiding our lives so we can make the best decisions possible. Well, even though that's there, if we deem a certain outcome worthy of an action that we would like to take, then really that law or commandment it doesn't really matter. And y'all have heard the phrase, the end justifies the means kind of thing, and that's pretty much what this is. And I think also situation ethics, this doing good and or setting aside laws so that we can get something good out of it, it waters down the concepts of grace and love to whatever someone wants grace to be, and to whatever someone wants love to be. And if everyone gets to define those terms on their own, that's perfectly okay. And then that's the way it ought to be. That's what this kind of idea promotes. And in trying to push this and trying to get this out, and it's called a new morality, even though it's been around for a long time, what we're usually given is these heart-wrenching what-if scenarios. Yeah, but what if this? What would you do if this happens? And those are meant to kind of pull and tug at our human emotions and compassion that I would say just about everybody has deep within them for the well-being of other people. I mean, our heart goes out to people in suffering situations. I mean, most people, if you got a heart, if you know what I'm talking about, most people care about how others are being treated and the things that they're going through in such way. So, and then the direction is somewhat shifted to the Bible. Well, let's see what the Bible says. And then someone said, well, yeah, but what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do in that situation? And that's kind of brought up as if Jesus would actually break the law, and actually he would throw away, kind of at least set aside God's law, at least for the time being, so some kind of greater good could be done. So if I were to ask you, did Jesus ever break the law? What would you say? And a lot of people would just say no. And especially people who know the Bible, because then we might follow that up with, have you ever read Hebrews 4 and verse 15? Which basically says that he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. So, well, if Jesus was, through his whole life here on earth, if he was without sin, then obviously he didn't break God's law. And you say, case closed. We could go, well, and then some people would say, well, he did. Some people kind of straddle the fence on this. They'll say, well, he didn't, but he did, though. And I thought about going into this tonight and then giving you the definition of religion and all of this is what people are trying to get. We're trying to get rid of church. We're trying to get rid of religion. And we only want to follow Jesus, which just makes really no sense at all. But so anyways, if I tell you, Jesus break law, you say, no, Hebrews 4:15, big boy. And so I say, okay, what about this? What are we to do with a verse like John 5 and verse 18? Now listen to it. Therefore, this is John. So this is not. This is John. This is the writer, and he says, therefore, he's explaining the situation. The Jews sought all the more to kill him, Jesus. Why? Because he not only broke the Sabbath, which was the law, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Okay, so what does that verse say? Now, if I were to ask you, if that's the only verse you knew, and I would say, and then I taught you, well, in Exodus 20, verse 10, it says that the Sabbath is the law. And then I read you this verse, and you didn't know about Hebrews 4:15. Let's just say, and I say, did Jesus break the law? And then you'd probably say, I mean, John explicitly says right there, doesn't he, that Jesus broke the keeping of the Sabbath, which was God's law at the time. And so did he break the law, or didn't he break the law? And how are we going to get this to harmonize with Hebrews 4 and verse 15? So, and I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios here. But do we find throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, the Gospels, do we find Jesus suspending the laws of God that were in place, suspending them, setting them aside, however you want to define it, for the greater good? Is he suspending the laws of God, at least temporarily, for the love of the people instead of the love for the law? And if so, shouldn't we follow in his footsteps? And when it comes to doing the greater good, can't we just set aside the laws of God so that good may come of it? That's the idea. And I want to give you a couple of passages, more than a couple of verses, a couple of passages where some would try to justify this situation ethics, where they say Jesus did. He did do it. Now, the first one is in John 8. Now, we're not going to read this. The second one's in Matthew 12, and we are going to read that passage. But this one, I think a lot of us are familiar with. This is where the woman who's caught in adultery, okay, and she's brought before Jesus. So the quick explanation is that the scribes and the Pharisees, they found where Jesus was, and they brought before him a woman who had been, the text says, caught in the act of adultery. And they said, Jesus, you know what the law says. The law of Moses requires her to be stoned. And now, what do you say about it? And Jesus ignored. This is where Jesus ignores them. He's kind of writing something in the sand or the dirt or whatever. And so he finally responds, and he says, one of a more well-known line: "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." We kind of word it in a little different way, but that's exactly what it says there. And so when he says that, and y'all know what happens? All of her accusers, like one by one, like probably not single file, but one by one, they were like, "All right, we're out of here," and they leave. And so Jesus says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "I don't know where they are. They're gone." And he says, "So neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Okay. Now the claim is Jesus released her from God's law at the time. So the claim is like, all right, well, because Jesus, how he operated, how he handled this situation, he basically set aside God's law of adultery, and he showed compassion and love for this woman, and so he kind of just let her go, because he could do that because he was God's son, right? And all this was done to show us that a love for people is way more important than actually obeying and keeping a divine commandment. And that we ought to be doing this today on a variety of subjects and a variety of situations. Okay. So really, what's going on here, and what did Jesus do? Well, it helps to understand the Old Testament law that is actually being talked about here. So you go back to Leviticus 20 and verse 10. Here's what the law says of adultery. Excuse me. It says, "The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." Right? Deuteronomy 22:22. "If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them shall die, the man that lays with the woman and the woman. So you shall put away the evil from Israel." All right. No, did you catch what I wanted you to catch? You might now think back to John 8, you might quickly realize that in the John 8 scenario, the guilty man whom this woman committed the adultery with, where's he at? Well, he's nowhere to be found, right? He's not in the picture, or so it seems anyways. And that's a problem because the scenario being the whole thing, just like they find Jesus and all of a sudden they thrust this problem at his feet and say, hey, what are you going to do about it? So it's very abrupt. It's outside of any kind of trial that may have taken place to figure out if there really were witnesses and what to do about it. And the punishment that is brought up by the scribes and the Pharisees, the stoning, doesn't squarely fit with what the law actually says. How many parties are supposed to be present? 2. How many parties were present here? 1. And so, if the guilty man could not be found, then the guilty woman could not be punished. So after keeping silent and repeatedly being asked a question, so when Jesus was kind of ignoring them and he's writing and saying or whatever, they're just constantly like, okay, hey, you hearing us? You listening to us? Jesus responds by flipping the guilt upon the woman's accusers. And so he says, right, he who's without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. Now here is where the don't judge me crowd, and you know what kind of crowd that is. The don't judge me crowd, maybe put it like that, gets very loud. And this is where, see, we promote love and mercy over any kind of judgment or divine justice or church discipline or whatever. Because after all, Jesus said, we're all sinners. And because we're all sinners, we really can't be casting judgment upon one another, right? But see, that view, so many problems with that. That view doesn't harmonize with the rest of the New Testament. Right? So what's one big rule in trying to figure out what a text is saying? If an interpretation doesn't harmonize with the rest of what God's word says about it, then guess what that says about the interpretation? It's wrong. It's a wrong interpretation. And I can't fix the scriptures. I gotta fix my interpretation, right? Judgment can take place, and it absolutely must take place, but, and we're aware of this, that it has to be the right judgment. It has to be proper judgment. That was not happening in John chapter 8, the scenario that we're reading. Now, Brother Dave Miller wrote some stuff about this, and I thought it was great. He suggested something that I want to share with you. He suggested that when Jesus says he was without sin cast the first stone, he's saying something far different than what the don't judge me crowd is saying. Now, before we get into that, listen to this passage right here. It's from Deuteronomy 17, 6 and 7. It says, whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. Now watch this. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death. And afterward, the hands of all the people, so you shall put away the evil from among you. So what you catch what the law is saying? The witnesses of the crime, of the sin, whatever it is, were to be the ones to literally cast the first stone in the punishment. Jesus just happens to say, he who is without sin let him throw the stone at her first. Why were the men walking away then? Well, either not a single one of them actually witnessed the adultery, which that's a problem and she's free to go. Or 2, maybe this is more likely, I'm not saying I want it to be, but it's possible, that they themselves were also guilty of practicing the very same sin, or at least ignoring or approving in others the very same sin that this woman was being accused of. It's probably likely that the man whom she was caught with was in the crowd. Or maybe 1 or 2 of them. however we'll put that. So this particular law on adultery was being twisted just to catch Jesus in some kind of trap and get him in trouble, not to see to it that justice was actually done, right? So Jesus could not have broken God's law here because, in a sense, there was no legitimate case brought forth for him to make any wrong decision on. It didn't even apply. Now, did Jesus show love and compassion here and mercy here on that woman? You better believe it. He absolutely did, but not at the expense of obedience to God's law, to God's command. Let's look at the other one here. This is in Matthew 12. We were in Matthew 17 this morning, so you already have that marked in your Bible. All you gotta do is go back a couple pages here. Matthew chapter 12. Now let's read this one, okay, together. Let's read the first 8 verses. Now this has to do with working on the Sabbath. All right, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread," now watch it, "which was not lawful for him to eat." Did David break the law? Jesus said, it's hard to say that David didn't do it. He broke the law. Nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. David took the bread, only that the priest should be eaten, and not only did David eat it, he let everybody else eat it. Verse 5, "Or have you not read," here's the second thing he brings up, "have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless." He's talking about his disciples. "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, we're not going to go through all of that and break it down, all of it. This is also found in the book of Mark, chapter 2 as well, and Luke chapter 6. All right, so what's going on here? Oh, Jesus set aside the law. Does this passage prove that Jesus justifies the disobeying of God's commands when a genuine necessity, let's say an emergency, arises? And can we do the same? So the law of the Sabbath, right? And a lot of us are familiar with the law about no work being done on the Sabbath day. You work for 6 days, on the Sabbath day you rest. The 7th day you rest. That's Exodus 20 and verse 10. But as this was given in the old law, not a lot of details came with it. Like they didn't define what work was in such great detail where everybody can figure it out. All we have is a few specific places spotted here and there about what was proper and what was not proper. So you'd have to go to Exodus 35 and verse number 3 to find that you could not make a fire to cook your food on the Sabbath. You needed to have food prepared, already ready to go for that particular day. You got to go all the way in Jeremiah, chapter 17, and Nehemiah, chapter 13, to learn that no trading goods, no business of any kind could be conducted on the Sabbath day. Now, as time went on, and we're aware of what the Pharisees did with the law. I would hope some we are. As time went on, man-made traditions began to be tacked onto this Sabbath law. No working on Sabbath. And so you have something called the Mishnah, which is a collection of oral traditions. It's like the first big book of Jewish oral traditions. Not written, just whatever the rabbis would say, and that got recorded down. And so these oral traditions, they have 39 specific prohibitions that amounted to work on the Sabbath. Right? Stuff you're not going to read in in the actual Torah, the Pentateuch. One of those 39 was reaping grain, right? Can't be reaping grain. And so it seems like when we read this text here in Matthew 12, it seems like that the Pharisees concluded that when the Jesus disciples went out and plucked the grains off, they were reaping. They were reaping grain. Oh, you can't do that. And when you read in Luke's account, the disciples, they plucked the grain, and it says, and I'm just assuming this is what they did. They rubbed it together, right? I've never ate grain like this. Maybe you guys ever, I don't know really, but I'd imagine you got to rub it off because it's in there somewhere, the grain is. And then the disciples probably went and blew the chaff away and then pop and eat the grain, right? Is that pretty much kind of how it will work? I think that's how it works, right? And so not only were they guilty of reaping, they were guilty of threshing grain, and they were guilty of winnowing grain. Ooh, such evil men, right? Such lawbreakers. And so then this is the Sabbath, and you can't be doing that kind of thing. All right? So this is why they're in a bill. Of course they want to catch Jesus in some kind of trap and get him in trouble. Now, the truth is, there you go. Truth is that Jesus' disciples were not breaking the Sabbath. See, and the thing was, you as a teacher, if you're a rabbi and your students are doing something, that means you automatically endorse it. So whatever the disciples were guilty of, it's automatic Jesus is guilty of it. So if they're breaking the law, Jesus is breaking the law, right? That's the thought. They were not breaking the Sabbath. What were they doing? Good night. They were eating. They were feeding themselves because they're hungry, all right? You can be sure that if they had been seen picking up a grain off the ground, then they would have been accused right off the bat because of that. They were breaking something. They were breaking those traditions, but they were not actually breaking the law itself. Breaking what had been added on to the law, right? So the law of the Sabbath had a lot to do with personal and economic gain for oneself. So the disciples weren't going out there and starting up the tractor and plowing the fields. And they weren't taking their goods to market to sell, to make a profit, right? They weren't, improving, building a new roof, improving their property value on the Sabbath. They weren't doing any of that. They were eating because they were hungry. A true human need, right? And that's not against God's law. Now, don't get this twisted. We understand that fulfilling a human need in a wrong way can go against God's law. But I hope you're understanding what I'm saying here. And it's really the same principle that the Pharisees themselves abided in when they would. Now, you can really quick glance at verse number 11 of Matthew 12. Same law when they would work to pull one of their own sheep. If it falls into a ditch and it happens to do it on the Sabbath, they're not going to leave it there. They're going to try to get it out. Oh, and that's not work, but popping off a little grain head is. Come on now. And so what Jesus does, he reminds them, he says, have you not read? And have you not read of two places in the Old Testament that the Pharisees would have been really, really familiar with? Now, the first one was with David. And this is in 1 Samuel 21, where this whole scenario takes place, and David breaks the law. Now, some would quickly say, all right, now, he's saying that David broke the law, and he's given this as an example to justify his disciples breaking the law. And so, right? Is that what he's doing? So David broke the law in a very dire situation, right? He's on the run from Saul, and he's hungry. David did it. And so Jesus and his disciples, because they were hungry, they were justified in breaking the law of God. But of course, that's not right. Not only did David, this part gets left out, not only did David, he did break the law. It was unlawful for him to do that. He did break the law by eating the bread that he should not have. He lied. I need to read 1 Samuel 21. He lied to the priest to get it. So it wasn't just that he was hungry and he's lying up there and he's on his knees and he's just reaching up. He said, priest, feed me. It wasn't like that. Jesus did not bring David up to justify his disciples breaking the law. Here's why I brought it up. Jesus is so smart, you know? He brought it up because he knew how revered David was to the Pharisees. This is King David we're talking about, you know? Even though he wasn't perfect, don't speak against King David, right? And they would not dare say that David broke God's law there. But he did. And here they are accusing the disciples when they were not breaking God's law. What Jesus is doing by bringing up David, he's simply calling out their motives. He knew that all they wanted to do was to trap him and get him in trouble. And then he brings up verse number 5. He says, or have you not read in the law? He reminds them that the priests, boy, those priests are hard at work in the temple every single Sabbath day, yet they remain blameless. Right? Priests are busy, very, very busy. See, temple work, which was commanded by God, that took precedent over the Sabbath command. It did not break the Sabbath command, or else God would be involved in a contradiction between these two laws, and we know that's not going to work. The Pharisees understood that perfectly. They got that. They understood it. And if they didn't care about what the priests were doing, then why in the world were they hounding these disciples? They knew that they were only out there breaking traditions and not what the actual law says. Jesus never broke God's law, nor did he ever condone it, nor did he ever endorse his disciples breaking God's law or laying it aside temporarily, and neither can we make that claim today. Now, what about John 5, verse 18, though? Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, but he also said that God was Father, make himself equal with God. So Jesus, not only did he was out there letting his disciples pluck grain on the Sabbath, Jesus did a lot of healing on the Sabbath. And well, that's more work. That's more work, according to the Pharisees. And John gives two reasons why they wanted him dead. One, he broke the Sabbath. Two, made himself equal with God. And so the question is, okay, wow, Hebrews 4:15 though. And so what's going on here? Did he actually break the Sabbath because of how John worded it? And here, this is the simple answer to this. John is simply writing from the Pharisees' perspective. Breaking the Sabbath was their reason why they wanted him dead. If you go back to verse 16, there you find John's perspective, and it's worded quite differently. He says, for this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done this thing or done these things on the Sabbath. And I think that we ought to note the difference of the wording between verse 16 and verse 18. John knew that Jesus didn't break God's law, didn't break the Sabbath. He's writing in verse 18 from the way that the Pharisees were saying it. And I think that's a good interpretation. Why? Because it harmonizes perfectly with the verse that everybody else knows all too well, which is Hebrews 4:15, that Jesus was without sin. Now, if I brought any other questions up on this text, I would love for you to get those to me. Let's close with this. There's a fundamental principle of situation ethics. Sorry, there you go. Pharisees view. I'm behind on my slides today. I apologize. There's a fundamental principle. There's actually 6 of them that you can get that you can pull from the Bible of situation ethics. And the first one is that love is the only thing that is intrinsically good. The only thing that is inherently good. Love, that's it. And any decision that anyone ever makes is only ever a good decision if it is a loving act that helps someone. If you do anything at all that hurts someone in any way whatsoever, that is a bad decision. It's a bad act. No rules, no laws, no commandments have anything to do with inherently good, loving acts. So says situation ethics. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, but one glaring one is a good definition of what a loving act is. right? Are we to just let everybody define what a loving act is for themselves and just go and just run with that? Can you imagine the mess that would create? It's like playing in a football game. Let's say we're gonna all get together and we're gonna play a football game, and the only rule is play fair. Not play fair according to the rules. That's not it. No, the only rule is play fair, and that's it. That's it. Well, you know what? If you don't define what fair is, you're not really going to have a game at all. Some kid might think that fair is smacking someone on the shoulder to tackle them, while this other guy thinks that taking the quarterback's head off is a tackle, as long as I don't put him in the grave. Whoa, okay, this is fair. And this guy said, no, this is fair. I mean, can't you see the problem? You can't just say play fair. There's got to be some definition there. And if we don't have some kind of objective definition of love and what a loving act is, then we're heading for some big, big problems. And so it takes God and it takes God's word to properly define what love is and to show how that biblical definition of love harmonizes with God's will and his desire for us to obey his commands. There's a disturbing passage, Judges 21:25, which says, in those days there was no king of Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Who would like to go back to that world? Who would like to go? Who would like to have a country where this is the only rule? Anybody? Let the record show for those who are watching online. Nobody raised their hand. Our world is heading for a repeat of this kind of history. And if you want to know how this plays out, how wonderful of an idea this is, read the last 3 chapters of Judges. And I think you'll be convinced that I don't think that's a good idea. But our world is heading toward a repeat of this, especially when those who are supposed to be the voice of morality and reason, I'm talking about Christians, we're heading for trouble when Christians are embracing principles like we've talked about tonight, where it's okay to say, let us do evil, that good may come. May it never be us. May it never be us. Appreciate your good attention tonight. You can obey the gospel, and I hope you would do that. We want to study with you. If you need to come back to the Lord and repent of any sins that's in your life that is preventing you from being faithful, preventing you from a home in heaven, then won't you make that right tonight, this very moment? We're going to grab our songbooks and we're going to stand, we're going to sing to encourage anyone to come forward that needs to. Let's do that.